Greg Abernathy is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Natural Lands Trust, a Berea-based nonprofit working to protect and connect and restore wildlands. He provides strategic leadership and management of KNLT's efforts, ranging from land acquisition to partnerships and outreach to wildlands philanthropy. Greg joined KNLT in 2012 after many years of assisting on special projects. He served as assistant director from 2012 to 17 and became executive director in 2018. He has had previous working experience for private, governmental, and nonprofit conservation organizations, both in Kentucky and throughout the Appalachian region and far north Appalachia too. Oh, he's been all over. Greg's background is in forest ecology, geographic information systems, and design, and you are going to be lucky to see some of the amazing things he has done and made today. I give you Greg Abernathy.
Thanks, Chris. And I want to thank the Center for inviting me and Kentucky Natural Lands Trust to present as we are on the cusp of celebrating the 51st Earth Day tomorrow. So I'm going to give a talk about the special places here in Kentucky that we like to refer to as the Kentucky Wildlands. And I'm going to offer some perspective on why these places are so important, why we all need to be aware of them and be working to protect more of them. I'm going to offer some perspective around biodiversity, climate resilience, and just transition as it relates to wildlands conservation. I'm a visual storyteller, so I am going to share slides, and I will move right into my presentation right now. So let me make sure. So I did want to just simply say Happy Earth Day to everyone, and I'd like to share just this quote because I think it's a really simple and wonderful reminder, and particularly in these times, is that the earth is what we all have in common. And this was written by Kentucky farmer and author Wendell Berry, who also is a Kentucky Natural Lands Trust advisor. He's long been a friend and more formally joined our group as an advisor just this year. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Kentucky Natural Lands Trust, we are a land trust that's connected as part of a national network called the Land Trust Alliance. And we are accredited, which means we're striving towards permanence as an organization, and we meet certain standards and practices. And for those of you here in Berea, we are right down on the square. We're above where Warren May had his office for so many years and his shops. Our office sits there. And we are also administratively attached to the Mountain Association that's long been a presence here in Berea. So our work spans from the mountains of Eastern Kentucky to the sloughs and wetlands of Western Kentucky. Over the last 25 years, we protected nearly over 50,000 acres of wildlands, some of those through direct projects we worked on at KNLT, and many through the power of partnership where we collaborated with other conservation partners and leveraged funding to pool together to protect lands around the state. And so I want to offer a little context of why should we care about wildlands. And I like to, no matter what group, I like to start with revisiting simply what is biodiversity. It is often referred to as simply as the web of life, which is a nice poetic explanation, but quite honestly, it's a much more complex definition. It's the variety of all living things and their roles and connections within ecosystems. And so I like to use this graphic to simply explain the different levels of biodiversity. At the core of the web of life is genetic diversity. This is the diversity that we find in individual species. And that genetic diversity is vital to that individual species' ability to persist on this planet. We move up to the next tier, which is species diversity. This is the diversity of individual unique species, whether it be a black bear or a luna moth or a black-throated green warbler or a hemlock tree. that diversity is very important and complements genetic diversity found in each of those individual species. Where we find species that occur together on the landscape, scientists have classified them as natural communities. And it's the diversity of these natural communities that are scattered over the larger landscape that creates ecosystem diversity. So it's this genetic species and ecosystem diversity that's repeated over and over across our entire Earth that creates the life support system for all life on the planet. Wildlands are clearly important from an ecological standpoint, but they also are vitally important to the cultural health, human health, and economic health of our communities and our citizens. So I like to use maps often when I do storytelling, and I want to give a little context and perspective on Kentucky. This is what a map that was created when I used to work for the state at the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. It's a conceptual map that's based on a lot of historical data of what Kentucky looked like pre-settlement. And what you see primarily is that you have vast areas of the state covered in forest. Nearly 85% of the state was forested. You have the tannish color on the map, which was millions of acres of prairies, and then the yellow is millions of acres of wetlands. If we fast forward to what Kentucky looks like today, it's a drastically different Kentucky in a relatively short period. What I want you to realize is that the yellow is still here in this map. The wetlands have been greatly reduced. They still exist out in Western Kentucky in large areas, but not nearly the extent that they were. Much of the prairie has been converted into agricultural lands, though there are remnant prairies that exist. And the forest has been reduced to about 50% of the state. Still a significant amount of the state is forested, and it's often a fact that we hear about Kentucky, that Kentucky is 50% forested. But we have to consider that there are nearly 85,000 miles of roads, over 10,000 miles of utility corridors and railroads, and all of these dice the forest into smaller and smaller ecological blocks. And so if we take this map and we look at fragmentation, this is what Kentucky's forests look like. All of the green forests are still here in this map. They've just been classified. So the really dark areas are where we find large, intact, ecologically functioning forest. And they still occur all throughout the state. But Eastern Kentucky is a greatly different picture than this big block of forest. The Cumberland Plateau has lots of unique areas. Pine Mountain does. Around Louisville, you find Bernheim Forest and stretching down to Mammoth Cave. There's still some really important, large, intact forests in the state. And this is what conservation looks like currently in our state. We have a mixture of federal lands that could be national parks or national forest. We have state lands that are state nature preserves, state parks, and wildlife management areas. We have local parks like those in Lexington or Louisville, or many local parks scattered in the communities around the state. And then we have what's classified as private and nonprofit lands, like the lands that KNLT protects or Bernheim Forest protects or other conservation partners, or private lands that have a tool called a conservation easement that's been placed on them. So all of that combined equates to about 8% of the state of Kentucky in some form of conservation. Realize that that conservation could take the form of biodiversity protection, or it could be more of a multi-use conservation land that still has some form of resource extraction. So it's a wide definition of conservation lands. Going back to our large forest tract map, I wanted to let you know about some work that conservation partners have reflected on. Where are the really important key areas that species depend upon, whether they're moving around within the state or migrating through the state as part of a larger continental movement of species. And these blue areas were pulled together by state, federal, and nonprofit partners to look at where some of the core corridors within the state. Many of these align with some of the really large intact forest, and this is what it looks like for really key habitat in the state. And much of this does align with existing conservation lands, though very large stretches of this are unprotected habitat at this point. This idea for Kentucky scales up into a continental vision called the Eastern Wildway, which is a continental scale vision for the really vital habitats throughout Eastern North America. And this all is an extension of what is known as the Half Earth Project, which was an initiative that was put forth by scientist E.O. Wilson a little more than 5 or 6 years ago. It's the concept that to sustain all life on the planet, we need to protect half of the planet to ensure that plants, animals, and natural systems are functioning to provide the services to sustain all life on the planet. What we see in this conceptual map of North America is that, in particular, Eastern Kentucky and Central Appalachia show up on this map as vitally important to sustaining all life on the planet. All of this has been really interesting research that's been emerging, but what I like to always tell people about is this publication that came out in 1992 as part of the Wild Earth Journal. It's called the Wildlands Project, and it was a vision for North America for protecting large landscapes to sustain biodiversity and the life support system on Earth. So the science has been there. KNLT has been tracking and part of this emerging science and working on this work all along, but we're seeing it take more and more traction and more discussion and more action. So there's a saying that I've heard physicists from the Southwest say is that it's time to believe what we know. And one way that is starting to take shape is the 30 by 30 Conservation Initiative, which was signed by an executive order in January, is aimed at conserving at least 30% of the US lands and oceans by 2030. Now, when we think about this, the intent of it is it's to safeguard the health, food supplies, biodiversity, and prosperity of every community. So it is around biodiversity conservation, but it's also around protecting agricultural systems and the working lands that are vital to sustaining our communities throughout the country. So when we think about large landscape conservation, it's a mixture of protecting forests, protecting wetlands, protecting grasslands, but also improving management on the forest lands that we need to use, the croplands that we depend on, and the grazing lands that we depend on, while also working to restore forest and wetlands. If we look at this map, I want to dive in and focus a little bit on where KNLT spends the bulk of our time down in far southeastern Kentucky. The Pine Mountain Wildlands corridor is where we do most of our work, and I'm going to try to annotate my pointer so it's easier to follow. So Pine Mountain is a 125-mile mountain ridge line that stretches from Tennessee through southeastern Kentucky up to Virginia. It's a long linear ridge. It is called a mountain, which is almost incorrect terminology because it is this long undulating ridge that stretches this whole distance. It's part of it, what's called an overthrust fault that created this unique geologic function. It has incredibly lush forest, and the focus on Pine Mountain is supported by a ever-emerging body of science that really speaks to this place being vitally important to conserving. The mountain is long and linear and hard to fit on a map, but this is Tennessee stretching up into Kentucky, all the way past Pineville to Harlan, past Cumberland, Whitesburg, and up to Elkhorn City on the Virginia-Kentucky line. And what you see there is it's a matrix of conservation lands, both by federal, state, and nonprofit partners. There are 10 primary organizations in addition to KNLT that hold lands on Pine Mountain. And so what's been achieved to date on Pine Mountain is really an extension of the power of partnership. And that's been funded by the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Fund, a state fund aimed at creating funding for purchasing and protecting land, and also through a mitigation fund run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Kentucky Natural Lands Trust aimed at protecting forest habitat for forest-dwelling species, particularly bats. Both of those funds are coupled with private philanthropy, which is an absolute vital part of keeping pace with what is needed at the scale and timing of conservation. So to date, Pine Mountain is 180,000 acres of wildlands. Nearly 40% is currently protected, and it's either state, federal, or nonprofit lands. And what I want to just point out here is since KNLT formed in 1995, we've done nearly 15,000 acres along Pine Mountain, which represents about 22% of all the protected lands that exist on the mountain. So we've had significant contributions to date. Some of those are lands that we still hold. Some of them are lands that we work with state partners, and they became special public lands like Blanton Forest that ended up in state ownership when we were at the front end of the transactions. So our work on Pine Mountain is framed in 3 key pillars. It's high biodiversity, climate resilience, and just transition. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes to talk about each of these pillars. Pine Mountain is home to thousands of species. There's nearly 100 that are considered rare, and there are a few that only occur on Pine Mountain, and they occur nowhere else on the entire planet. These are endemic species that are found in some of the unique caves that we find along the north face of Pine Mountain. Pine Mountain's within central Appalachia, which is part of the mixed Mesophytic forest. This is the second most diverse temperate zone forest found on the planet. The most diverse forest is found in Southeast Asia, and it's up against the Himalayan mountains, and it just has more elevational gradient, so it gets more species than we find here. But an incredibly important forest in the temperate zone is found throughout eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Pine Mountain sits right within that. It's also where streams originate, and it's part of a broader, massive watershed that creates the Mississippi River watershed, which is the 4th largest watershed on planet Earth. So if you end up on Pine Mountain up at the summit, that rain that you might have falling on you if you're there is ultimately headed all the way down to New Orleans as part of this massive watershed on the Earth. It's also part of a really important existing migratory corridor, and also projected corridors as species begin to shift in response to climate change. What we see here is this corridor is the Appalachian Chain, and Kentucky in particular and Pine Mountain are a vital link in species being able to migrate and shift their habitats in response to changing climate. So I want to jump into climate resilience. This is an emerging concept that is around the idea that some landscapes have particular conditions that make them more resilient to climate change. And that means that the plants, animals, and natural systems found here are better positioned to persist and adapt in the face of climate change. The core to climate resilience are 3 primary areas. It has to do with the physical features, the geology of a region and the resulting landforms, the connectedness of a region. It's both at different scales, how locally connected it is and how regionally connected it is. And then also the biological condition. What is the level of biodiversity that we find in a region? So we know that Central Appalachia is incredibly rugged terrain, and it offers a wide variety of different habitats to species that are found there. And this is a resiliency map, and what we see is much of eastern Kentucky, including Pine Mountain, ranks really high when it comes to climate resilience. So the third tier I want to talk about is just transition, which is focused on finding a more just, equitable, and sustainable future for eastern Kentucky as it transitions its economy away from what has primarily been based on a coal economy. And I'm going to borrow some words from a friend of mine, Robert Geip, who so poetically reminds us that just transition has to be intersectional. It's protection of the land and water, protection of people of all races, genders, identities, coupled with sustainable and resilient economic structures. So we know that wildlands are really important, both culturally, cultural health, human health, and economic health. They play a really important role with outdoor recreation, tourism, and livability tied with the communities that are found along protected wild areas. And in particular, Pine Mountain is a pathway of an unfolding trail called the Great Eastern Trail. This is a trail that is been unfolding from southern New York down to Alabama with lateral connections to the Appalachian Trail. But through Kentucky, it primarily travels along Pine Mountain. It's about a 100-mile section of the trail that's been unfolding from Breaks Interstate Park in the north and is nearly to Kingdom Come State Park. And from Kingdom Come, it will stretch down to Pineville and then drop down to Cumberland Gap National Historic Park in Middlesboro. So the protected wildlands along this route are what make the trail possible to extend and build out and to help to add to the diversified economy of the region. And we know from research from the Outdoor Industry Association that outdoor recreation in particular does play an important role in our national economy and in particular in Kentucky's economy. And it is a growing sector that has really positive impacts for our state from jobs, wages, and taxes. So high biodiversity, climate resilience, and just transition is what's at the core and root of the work that we've been doing for 25 years. Pine Mountain is not without its threats. There's still existing resource extraction happening in the form of limestone quarries. There's still large-scale logging that happens that fragments the forest. And there is the ever emerging and growing threat around non-native species that are spreading and invasive species that outcompete native species. And then a final area that is creating challenges for conservation is the generational shift that's afoot in the region and out throughout the US. And as land changes hands, the ownership of that land as it goes from generation to generation gets more and more fragmented, which can be really, really difficult to pull an acquisition together as it becomes more fragmented among multiple owners moving forward. So I wanted to just give you a little spotlight on how KNLT does the work that we do. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. I want to give you a visual exploration of Pine Mountain. And I'm going to start down here on the far southern end in Kentucky, and we'll end up here in Elkhorn City. So this is a stretch in far southwestern portion of the mountain called Laurel Fork. It's part of the Archer Bend State Nature Preserve, a really unique aquatic system that's found there near the Tennessee line. We come up to Pineville. This is a picture from in Pine Mountain State Scenic Park, or Pine Mountain State Park, that is looking across the Cumberland River here at the bottom. And this is looking over at Kentucky Natural Lands Trust Preserve called the Narrows. This is actually a really interesting spot in Pineville, and it's as equally as important as Cumberland Gap was to Western expansion, because as people came through Cumberland Gap, they ended up here at the Narrows where they were able to cross part of the Cumberland River and continue migration up into central Kentucky. And also notable about the Narrows is this is where there's one of those very unique caves that has a cave beetle that's only found in this cave and nowhere else in the entire world. Moving closer to Harlan, this is Blanton Forest State Nature Preserve. This was KNLT's origin story. This is what really launched our work back in the mid-90s. Largest tract of old growth forest found in Kentucky. This is Warbler Ridge up near Cumberland, Kentucky. This is our most recent acquisition, and it represents nearly 2,500 acres of wildlands that connect to state lands, forming thousands of acres of contiguous wildlands. And this is along the route that's unfolding for the Great Eastern Trail. And I like this picture because you can really see the ridge line of Pine Mountain just stretching off and off into the distance. This is Kingdom Come Preserve, which is on the edge of Kingdom Come State Park, right outside of Cumberland. This is one of the most iconic overlooks on Pine Mountain. And actually, this was an acquisition that KNLT did about 3 or 4 years ago. And we bought land surrounding the state park. And it turned out that this overlook was actually not on the state's land when it was originally constructed. And KNLT helped protect and purchase the overlook and works with state parks on management of this overlook, which is a really important part of regional tourism and an iconic part of the mountain. Going up to Whitesburg, we find Bad Branch, which is one of the most diverse regions on Pine Mountain. And it's also home to a 60-foot waterfall that's absolutely exquisite and worth the trek to go and see. And then finally, at the northeastern end of the mountain, where we come to Breaks Interstate Park, which straddles the Kentucky and Virginia line. It's considered the Grand Canyon of the South. It's an incredibly deep gorge and really unique river system that rushes through this interstate park, which is only one of only 2 interstate parks found in the United States. So I wanted to give a little spotlight on how KNLT does its work, and we're going to focus in on the Pine Mountain map up here by Harlan at our origin story, Blanton Forest. This is where KNLT's work all began in the mid-90s. This was some work that the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves was doing at the time, doing inventory work in Eastern Kentucky, and an ecologist by the name of Mark Evans, who is on the KNLT board currently and a longtime partner in all of this work, was doing helicopter surveys to look for unique areas to go and explore on the ground. And he flew over this stretch outside of Harlan and realized that there was a vast area of old growth trees that had never been cleared. And upon ground confirmation, it was confirmed, and it was 2,000 acres of old growth, which was 10 times the largest known tract at that time of old growth that we knew about in Kentucky. So a group of friends stepped forward and started our organization and worked with the Office of State Nature Preserves to protect what became Blanton Forest. But what I want to show you is this is what Blanton looks like today. The green is state lands, the purple is are lands that KNLT has protected. It represents nearly 7,000 plus acres. But I just want to show you, when you look at a map of protected places, there's a lot of complex story behind that. And in 1995, when the old growth forest was discovered, this is what the ownership looked like in the area. All of these black lines are individual owners, typically individual families that own tracts of land. And I'm just going to walk through from 95 to today to show you how KNLT has partnered with our state partner, the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, to build out this nearly 7,000 acres of land. And so I'm not going to narrate each slide, but you'll see lands that are either green that are state or purple that are KNLT, and some KNLT lands start as purple, and then we worked to roll them into the state system and build out the nature preserve. And so I'm just going to click through a few slides, and you see these lands growing slowly over time. Since 1995, there have been nearly 20 transactions that have built out what is now the nearly just over 7,000 acres of wild places that represent Blanton Forest and the preserves that KNLT holds around Blanton Forest. So we do that model over and over and over all along Pine Mountain. I like to refer to it as our patience and persistence model. Most of these lands are lands that are not for sale. So it's building relationships with landowners to attempt to purchase land from them. And sometimes those relationships and conversations might take 18 months. Sometimes they could take 18 years. So it's a patience and persistence model. that is what has led to the conservation successes that we can claim along Pine Mountain. So if you've not been to Pine Mountain, I'm going to tell you that it is calling, and when conditions permit, you absolutely need to find yourself there. It's an incredibly important part of our natural heritage here in Kentucky, and the region is just incredibly unique, from the natural features to the communities that you find along Pine Mountain. So put it on your list, make a commitment to yourself that you will go and visit this natural treasure that we have right here in Kentucky. And I wanted to kind of wrap up before we start our conversation with a quote from one of my conservation heroes, whose name is Doug Peacock. He was a naturalist and an author that did a lot of work out in the West. And, in these times, I think we all know and reflected over the last year of just how valuable friendships and networks are. And this kind of work does not happen without friendships and partnerships. So I just used Doug's quote here to say, arm yourself with friendship and love the earth. And I hope that you all will consider joining us even online tomorrow for some online opportunity to celebrate Earth Day. And maybe Chris and I can talk a little bit about during our conversation. And we're going to have a conversation now, but I welcome anyone to reach out directly to me as a follow-up. And if you're thinking about going to Pine Mountain, but you're not familiar with it, I'm happy to share some recommendations on how best to start exploring the region. And again, I'm incredibly grateful to Chris and the Center for inviting me to be part of this conversation of this long-running series. And I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to speak with everyone today.